When I found out what my classmate was planning to do, I decided to bug him about it every single day until he gave up. When I found out my classmate planned to take his own life, I decided to help him in the way everyone warned me not to. Ian used to be the guy everyone wanted to hang out with. The type to help freshmen with algebra then turn around and throw spirals with the seniors. The type to sit with the quiet kids because he never wanted anyone to be alone. He never cared that no one asked how he was doing. He just focused on making others happy. But last year he changed abruptly. He stopped smiling, started getting into fights over nothing. So like everyone else, I kept my distance. Until he left his notebook in class one Thursday afternoon. I was about to hand it over to the teacher when it fell open. The moment my eyes read what was on the page, it was too late. The handwriting was messy and desperate, and the small wrinkled spots were clearly tear stains. But it was the words that made my hands shake uncontrollably. I can't do this anymore. Everything hurts too much. I'm so sorry. I felt my breath stuck in my throat. There were pages and pages talking about giving up, about how it'd be easier if everything just stopped. And I wasn't sure what to do, so I went to my friends for help. My best friend Rika closed the notebook shut and shook her head at me. Look, I know this is bad, but please don't get involved with him. He literally got suspended last semester when he fought one of his old friends. And you're practically a stranger to him, she advised. But Ian helped me once, remember? 3 years ago when I had a panic attack during my presentation, he sat down with me in the hallway and stayed with me until I was done crying. I insisted. Rika let out a sigh while my other friend Maddie forced a smile. We know you'll do it anyway. Just promise you'll walk away if things go south, okay? I immediately found Ian after school, walking toward the parking lot with his hood up and headphones on. I chased after him, basically jogging just to keep up. Hey, wait up! Let's walk home together. He glanced down at me, but when I grinned at him, he gave an annoyed look and walked faster towards his house. I chased after him anyway, rambling about the weather and homework and literally anything that came to mind. When he turned on his street, I stopped and waved and yelled, "See you tomorrow," as loud as I could. But he never responded. The next day at lunch, I sat down across from him with my tray and smiled. He stared at me for exactly 3 seconds before picking up his stuff and moving to another empty table. My friends waved at me from across the room and mouthed, "We told you. Just give up." But I couldn't. That afternoon, I tried joining him on the track during PE, thinking we could maybe jog and chat together. But the moment he saw me coming, he just sprinted away like I was chasing him down with a machete. For the next few days, it went on like that between us. But here's the thing. The more I annoyed him, the more I started noticing small changes. Like how on the 4th day of me walking home behind him, he slowed down just enough that I could actually keep up. And when I sat across from him at lunch, he stayed and ate with his headphones in while I rambled about my day. 2 weeks in, he finally cracked. When I tripped and fell onto the track, he stopped and bent down to carry me to the side of the grass and asked, "What do you want from me?" I felt my heart race hearing his voice. "I just want to be friends with you," I said simply. He stared at me before letting out a sad laugh. "You're crazy." "Maybe," I shrugged. "But you're stuck with me now." Then something crazy happened after that. Whenever I'd walk over to him, he'd pull down his headphones and actually chat with me. And slowly I started seeing glimpses of the old Ian. The one who'd make sarcastic comments that'd make me laugh so hard I'd snort. The one who'd hold the door open without thinking about it. The one whose smile melted everyone in the room. He even started changing at school, talking to others without that edge in his voice. And I felt proud, thinking I actually managed to pull him from the dark place like he once did for me. But then he saw it. We were hanging out at the bookstore when Ian reached into my bag for a pen and froze. His jaw tightened as he slowly pulled out the notebook. "Why do you have this?" he asked quietly. My mouth went dry. I was going to give it back, but he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. "You read it, didn't you? That's why you've been doing all this. I thought you cared, but this was all just some pity party to you." "I do care." I stood up too, my voice louder than I meant it to be. "It started with the notebook. But that's not why I stayed." I took a deep breath. "I stayed because I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between us. His eyes widened, anger melting. He sank back into the chair, the notebook still in his hands. "This isn't my notebook." And what he said next made everything click into place. The reason why he became closed off. And honestly, it broke my heart more than his answer to my confession. His hands started shaking as he held the notebook tighter, and when he spoke again, his voice came out so quiet, I almost couldn't hear him over the background music playing in the bookstore. "This was my sister Madison's notebook. She killed herself last year." The words hit me like someone punched me straight in the stomach. Everything around us got really quiet and small, like the walls were moving closer and I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. All those pages I read, all those sad, desperate words about giving up and being sorry, they weren't Ian's thoughts. They were his little sister's last words before she died. I felt my legs go weak, and I dropped back into the chair across from him, my whole body suddenly too heavy to hold up. My confession about loving him was still just hanging there between us, and now it felt stupid and small compared to what he just told me. Ian kept talking, his voice flat and empty like he was reading from a script he'd said too many times. Madison was a freshman last year, only 14 years old, and she'd been fighting depression for months. Their parents got her into therapy and put her on medication, but nothing seemed to help enough. Ian found this notebook in her room 2 months after she died. hidden under her mattress where no one thought to look during those first terrible weeks. Reading her words was the closest he could get to hearing her voice again, so he started carrying it everywhere even though it hurt every single time he opened it. The fights at the school started 3 months ago when some junior made a joke during lunch about someone being so dramatic they should just kill themselves. Ian heard it from across the cafeteria and something inside him just snapped. He walked over and punched the kid so hard he broke his nose, got suspended for 2 weeks, and didn't even care about the consequences. After that, any mention of suicide or depression or giving up made him so angry he couldn't think straight, couldn't control the rage that came flooding up from somewhere deep and dark inside him. I sat there listening and felt my entire understanding of the past 2 weeks just completely fall apart. Ian wasn't planning to hurt himself. He wasn't the one drowning in suicidal thoughts. He was drowning in guilt and grief because he didn't save his sister. All my cheerful persistence, all those times I chased him down and forced conversations and sat at his table uninvited, suddenly felt so dumb and pushy. I thought I was being some kind of hero, saving someone from the edge like he once saved me. But really, I was just this annoying girl who completely misread everything and made his grief about my need to feel useful. I wasn't offering real friendship. I was performing some rescue mission based on wrong information, treating him like a project instead of a person. Ian looked up at me with eyes so red and tired, and I could see he'd been crying for way longer than just today. "Are you going to leave now?" he asked, and his voice cracked right in the middle. "Now that you know I'm not some project you can fix?" I get it if the confession was just part of trying to save someone, if it wasn't actually real feelings. The way he said it made my chest hurt worse than anything. Like he expected me to walk away now that the truth was different from what I thought. Like people had been walking away from him for a whole year. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand before I could think about it, holding on tight so he'd know I meant what I was about to say. "I started talking to you because of the notebook. That part's true. But I stayed because of who you are. The way you make sarcastic comments that actually make me laugh. The way you still hold doors open for people even when you're having the worst day. The way you smile sometimes and it feels like the sun coming out." My own voice was shaking now, but I kept going. My feelings are real. Maybe the timing is terrible and everything's complicated and scary, but they're real. We stayed in that bookstore for another hour after that, just sitting at our table while Ian told me about Madison. How she was really funny and loved making terrible puns that made everyone groan. How she always wore mismatched socks on purpose because she thought matching was boring. How she'd leave little notes around the house for their parents to find, just saying she loved them. How their mom and dad still can't go into her room because it hurts too much to see all her stuff exactly where she left it. Ian cried while he talked, tears just streaming down his face, and I cried too, because hearing about this girl I never met made her feel so real and so gone at the same time. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, more real than all those 2 weeks of me chattering at him about homework and weather. When we finally left the bookstore, the sun was starting to set and the air outside felt cold against my wet face. Ian stopped on the sidewalk and looked at me kind of nervous. "Can we take things slow? Like, I don't know how to be in a relationship when I'm still this broken. When I'm still carrying around my dead sister's notebook and crying in bookstores." I nodded so fast I probably looked ridiculous. "Yes, absolutely. We can take things however you need them to be." The relief on his face made something in my chest relax. At least we were being real with each other now instead of pretending everything was suddenly fine and perfect. That night after I got home, I called Rika and told her everything that happened. There was this long silence on the phone before she finally spoke. I knew about Madison. Half the school knows Ian lost his sister last year. But nobody knows how to bring it up because death makes everyone so uncomfortable. We just avoid talking about it and pretend everything's normal, which is probably why Ian felt so alone. She sounded guilty, like she should have done something different. "I should have told you before you went chasing after him with that notebook." But I didn't know how to explain without making it worse. We talked for almost an hour about grief and how people handle it, and how the whole school just went silent about Madison after the funeral like she never existed. Rika admitted she felt terrible watching Ian change and withdraw, but didn't know what to do besides give him space. Now she wondered if space was the wrong thing, if what he actually needed was for someone to not walk away. The next day at the school felt different. I saw Ian in the hallway before first period and everything looked the same but also completely changed. He was still the guy carrying impossible weight on his shoulders, but now I understood what that weight actually was. When I sat down at lunch across from him, he didn't get up and move. Instead, he actually smiled a tiny bit, pulled out his headphones and held one earbud out to me. "Want to listen? It's Madison's favorite songs. I made a playlist of everything she used to play constantly." I took the earbud and put it in, and some pop song from a few years ago started playing. Ian watched my face while I listened, and for the first time since I met him, he looked a little bit lighter. Not fixed or healed or better, but like maybe sharing this small piece of his sister with someone else made the carrying slightly less heavy. The next day at lunch, I grabbed my tray and headed toward Ian's usual spot in the corner. He was already there with his headphones in, picking at his food without really eating. I sat down across from him and started talking about this stupid thing that happened in English class, just normal stuff to fill the space. He nodded along, not really listening but not leaving either, which felt like progress. Then I saw someone walking toward our table, and the way Ian's whole body went stiff made me look up. Viola stood there holding her lunch tray, looking like she might turn around and walk away any second. Ian pulled his headphones down slowly and just stared at her. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other and bit her lip before speaking. She said she'd been watching us from across the cafeteria for the past week, and seeing Ian actually smile again made her realize they needed to talk. Ian's jaw got tight and he looked down at his food. Viola kept going, saying she knew being around him hurt because it reminded her of losing Madison, but avoiding each other wasn't helping anyone heal. She asked if they could meet after school, maybe at the library where it was quiet. Ian didn't answer for what felt like forever, then finally nodded once without looking at her. Viola let out this shaky breath and said she'd see him there at 3:30 before walking away quickly. The rest of lunch was weird and tense. Ian put his headphones back in and didn't talk at all, just stared at his tray while I tried to act normal and failed completely. When the bell rang, he got up fast and disappeared into the hallway before I could say anything. After school, I followed Ian to the library, even though he didn't ask me to come. He stopped outside the main doors and turned to me looking tired. He said he needed to do this alone, that having me there would make it harder somehow. I told him I'd wait outside and he could text me when he was done. He went inside and I sat on the concrete steps, watching students leave campus and buses pull away. An hour passed and I checked my phone about 50 times. Finally, the library doors opened and Ian came out first, followed by Viola. Both of them had red eyes and tear tracks on their faces, but something about them looked different. Lighter, maybe, like they'd put down something heavy they'd been carrying separately. Viola gave me a small smile as she walked past and Ian sat down next to me on the steps. He didn't say anything about what happened, and I didn't ask, just sat there with him until he was ready to walk home. Over the next few days, something changed at lunch. Rika and Maddie started sitting with us instead of waving from across the room. At first, Ian seemed uncomfortable with more people at the table, but Rika made stupid jokes that actually made him laugh, and Maddie talked about normal stuff like homework and her annoying little brother. Then one day, Ian mentioned Madison without his voice breaking, just a casual comment about how she used to steal his hoodies. Instead of everyone going quiet and weird, Maddie nodded and said her cousin died 2 years ago from cancer. She explained how the worst part wasn't the grief itself, but how everyone acted like mentioning her cousin's name would make Maddie shatter. People's awkwardness made the loss worse because it turned her cousin into this thing nobody could talk about. Ian looked at Maddie for a long moment and said that's exactly how he felt, like Madison became invisible after the funeral. Our lunch table slowly became this space where Ian could say his sister's name without everyone freezing up or changing the subject. 2 weeks after the bookstore, my phone rang during dinner, and my mom handed it to me saying it was someone named Raina. I took the phone confused because I didn't know anyone named Raina. Then the woman on the other end introduced herself as Ian's mom. My stomach dropped. She said Ian had been talking about me a lot, and she wanted to invite me to dinner at their house this Friday if I was free. Her voice sounded hopeful but also nervous, like she expected me to say no. I glanced at my parents who were watching me with curious faces. I told Raina I'd love to come, even though my hands were shaking. She gave me their address and said 6 o'clock would be perfect, then thanked me 3 times before hanging up. Ian texted me later that night warning me his mom had been wanting to meet the girl who got him talking to people again. He said I didn't have to come if it was too weird, but I could tell he actually wanted me there. Friday came too fast. I stood on Ian's front porch at exactly 6 o'clock, holding flowers my mom insisted I bring, trying to calm my racing heart. Ian opened the door and led me inside to a living room covered in photos. Madison was everywhere. On the walls, on the mantle, on side tables and frames, school pictures, family vacations, candid shots of her laughing. There were so many that it felt like she was still living there. The dining room had 4 place settings but 5 chairs, and that empty chair at the table made my throat tight. Raina came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a towel and pulled me into a hug before I could even say hello. She smelled like pasta sauce and her eyes were already wet. Ian's dad Grayson shook my hand without smiling and sat down at the head of the table without saying much. Dinner was awkward and painful. Raina kept asking me questions about school and my family, clearly trying to fill the silence. Grayson cut his food into tiny pieces and chewed slowly, staring at his plate. Ian's jaw was tight and he barely ate. Halfway through the meal, Grayson's phone buzzed and he looked at it, then stood up abruptly. He said he had to take care of something at work, and left without finishing his food or saying goodbye. Ian's hands curled into fists on the table, and I saw that familiar anger flash across his face. Raina's eyes filled with tears, but she kept smiling, kept trying to act like everything was fine. After we finished eating, Raina asked Ian to help her with dishes and pulled me into the hallway instead. She grabbed both my hands and thanked me for being Ian's friend, her voice breaking. Then she started crying for real, apologizing over and over for falling apart. She admitted she didn't know how to help Ian when she could barely make it through each day herself. She said Grayson shut down completely after Madison died, and now she felt like she was losing both her husband and her son. I realized this whole family was drowning separately in the same ocean of grief, each one too tired to reach for the others. When Ian drove me home later, I brought up our school counselor. I mentioned that Mr. Oswald actually worked with grief counseling and maybe talking to someone professional could help. Ian's whole body tensed and his hands gripped the steering wheel harder. He said he wasn't crazy. He was just sad, and therapy wouldn't bring Madison back. So what was the point? I tried to explain that wasn't what I meant, but he cut me off saying he was fine and didn't need someone analyzing his feelings. We sat in silence in my driveway until I got out of the car. The next day, Viola found me before first period. She pulled me aside near the lockers and told me she'd been seeing Mr. Oswald since Madison died. She said it was the only reason she was still able to function, that having someone to talk to who understood grief made everything slightly less impossible. I asked if she'd be willing to talk to Ian about it, friend to friend, without making it seem like we were ganging up on him. She agreed immediately. But Ian didn't give her the chance. He started avoiding me at the school, taking different routes to class, sitting at a different lunch table. When I texted him, his responses came back short and cold. Just 1 or 2 words instead of actual conversation. Rika found me in the library looking at my phone waiting for Ian to respond. She sat down across from me and said I needed to stop pushing so hard. She explained that grief wasn't something you could schedule and manage like a school project, that Ian needed to come to therapy on his own terms. I knew she was right, but it killed me to watch him pull away again. 3 days of silence felt like 3 years. Then Tuesday night at 10 o'clock, my doorbell rang. My dad looked through the peephole and turned to me confused, asking if I knew why Ian was on our porch this late. I ran to the door and opened it to find Ian standing there looking completely exhausted. His eyes were red and his hair was messy like he'd been running his hands through it. He apologized for shutting me out and asked if we could talk. We sat on my porch steps in the dark and he admitted he was scared. He said if he talked to a counselor, he'd have to let go of Madison, and she was all he had left of the person he used to be before everything fell apart. I grabbed his hand and held it tight. He looked at me like he was about to cry, and I told him that remembering Madison wasn't the same as healing from losing her. He could keep every memory, every joke she made, every weird thing she did with her socks, and still learn to live without drowning in the pain every single day. He wiped his eyes with his free hand and nodded slowly. We sat there for another hour just talking about random stuff, and when he finally left, he actually smiled a little and said he'd think about what I said. The next morning at the school felt different somehow. I walked through the hallway toward my locker and noticed 3 girls from Madison's old friend group standing near the water fountain. They stopped talking when they saw me and just stared with these cold looks on their faces. One of them whispered something to the others, and they all turned away. I felt my stomach twist but kept walking. At lunch, it happened again. I sat down at our usual table and saw the same girls 2 tables over, pointing at me and talking behind their hands. Viola sat down across from me and immediately noticed. She asked what was wrong, and I told her about the staring and whispering. Her face got all tight and she let out this frustrated sigh. She explained that Madison's former friend group thought I was trying to replace Madison in Ian's life, which made 0 sense, but showed how messed up everyone's grief had become. She said they'd been talking about it for days, saying Ian needed space to mourn properly, not some new girl acting like his girlfriend. I felt anger rise in my chest but tried to stay calm. The bathroom confrontation happened 2 days later. I walked in during passing period and found myself face to face with the obvious leader of the group, a girl with perfectly straight hair and a mean look in her eyes. She crossed her arms and told me I needed to back off from Ian because he needed space, not some new girlfriend playing therapist. Something in me snapped. I stepped closer and told her that ignoring Ian for an entire year hadn't helped him one bit, so maybe she should worry about her own guilt instead of judging me. Her eyes went wide and her face turned red. She opened her mouth to say something, but I walked past her and left. My hands were shaking the whole way to class. By the end of the week, everyone knew about the bathroom fight. People kept taking sides in the hallways, some saying Ian should be allowed to move on, others saying he was disrespecting Madison's memory. Groups of students would stop talking when I walked by, then start up again once I passed. I heard my name whispered at least 10 times a day. The whole thing was completely exhausting and made me understand why Ian had shut everyone out in the first place. Nobody actually cared about helping him. They just wanted to feel right about their own reactions to Madison's death. I spent lunch in the library that Friday just to avoid all the staring and whispers. Rika found me there and sat down without saying anything. She just put her hand on my shoulder and we sat in silence for 20 minutes. My phone buzzed during dinner that Sunday. Ian had texted saying he made an appointment with Oswald for next Tuesday after school. He added that he wanted me to know it was because he actually wanted to get better, not because I had pressured him into it. I read the message 3 times and felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, but I also felt scared because I knew this was just the beginning of a really long process. I texted back that I was proud of him, and he sent back a simple thanks. Monday morning, Viola caught up with me before first period. She asked if Ian and I wanted to visit Madison's grave with her on Sunday. She explained that she went every week and thought maybe Ian was ready to go back. She said he hadn't been since the funeral because his parents couldn't handle it, and he'd been too angry to go alone. I told her I'd ask him, and she gave me this grateful smile. When I brought it up to Ian at lunch, he got really quiet. He stared at his food for a long time before finally nodding and saying, okay. Sunday morning was cold and gray. We met Viola at the cemetery entrance and walked together through rows of headstones until we reached Madison's. It had a simple gray stone with her name and dates, and someone had left fresh flowers the week before. Ian stood there frozen for almost a minute, just staring at the ground. Then his whole body started shaking, and he dropped to his knees in front of the headstone. He started apologizing over and over, saying he was sorry for not noticing she was struggling, for being too busy with football and friends to see her pain. His voice broke and tears ran down his face. Viola and I moved to stand on either side of him, and we all cried together. The wind picked up and made the trees around us shake. Ian kept talking to the stone like Madison could hear him, telling her about school and the mental health club, and how much he missed her terrible puns. After a while, Viola knelt down next to Ian and pulled something from her jacket pocket. She said Madison had left her a note before she died, saying she was sorry and that it wasn't anyone's fault. Ian's face completely fell apart when he realized Madison hadn't left him a note. He asked why in this broken voice that made my chest hurt. Viola reached out and touched his arm gently. She explained that Madison probably couldn't face writing to him because she knew it would hurt him the most. Ian put his head in his hands and sobbed harder than I'd ever seen anyone cry. We stayed at the cemetery for 2 more hours, just sitting by Madison's grave and talking about memories. Viola told stories about Madison's obsession with collecting weird socks, and Ian actually laughed a little through his tears. Tuesday after school, Ian went to his first session with Oswald. I waited in the library doing homework until he was done. When he came out, he looked completely drained, but something in his shoulders seemed less tight. We walked to my house, and he told me Oswald said survivor's guilt was totally normal, but that Ian had been punishing himself in ways Madison would never have wanted. The counselor had asked him what Madison would say if she could see how he was treating himself, and Ian realized she'd be mad at him for giving up on everything she loved about him. He said it hurt to think about, but also helped somehow. That night, Ian texted me saying dinner at his house had gone really bad. I called him immediately, and he explained that his dad, Grayson, had exploded during the meal, yelling that he was tired of everyone crying all the time and couldn't they just move on already. Ian had yelled back that you can't just decide to stop grieving like flipping a switch. Raina had started sobbing between them, and Ian had left the table and locked himself in his room. I could hear how upset he was through the phone. I told him he could come stay at my house if he needed to, and he said he'd think about it. We talked for another hour until his voice got calmer, and he said he was going to try to sleep. After we hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about how grief was tearing his whole family apart in different directions, and wondering if they'd ever find a way back to each other. 3 days after that phone call, Raina contacted me around 8 at night, asking if Ian could stay at our place for a while. Her voice sounded exhausted and kind of broken when she explained that Grayson had checked into a hotel downtown and refused to come home until everyone stopped making such a big deal about everything. She said the house felt too empty and too full at the same time, and Ian kept locking himself in his room without eating. My mom picked up the other phone and listened while Raina talked, and then she told Raina to send Ian over right away. He showed up 40 minutes later with a backpack and his eyes all red like he'd been crying in the car. My dad set him up in the guest room without asking any questions, just showed him where the towels were and said to help himself to anything in the kitchen. That first night, Ian barely came out except to grab some water, and I could hear him moving around in there until really late. The next morning, though, something shifted. I was making cereal when Ian walked into the kitchen and actually started talking to my little brother about some video game they both played. My brother lit up and started rambling about strategy or whatever, and Ian listened and made jokes and even laughed at something my brother said. I stood there with the milk carton in my hand just staring, because I hadn't heard Ian laugh like that in forever. Over the next few days, having Ian in my house became this weird normal thing. We'd do homework at the kitchen table together, and he'd help my brother with math problems, and my parents would make extra food at dinner without making it a big deal. At night, after everyone went to bed, Ian and I would end up talking in the living room about random stuff like movies and music and stupid things that happened at the school. He told me about this prank he and his old friends pulled freshman year, where they filled someone's locker with packing peanuts, and he smiled the whole time he told the story. I realized how much of his real personality had just disappeared under all the grief and anger. He was actually funny in this sarcastic way that made me laugh until my stomach hurt, and he did this thing where he'd mock terrible reality TV shows while watching them. My brother started following him around like Ian was the coolest person ever, and Ian would play video games with him and let him win sometimes. It felt almost normal, except it wasn't, because his dad was still at a hotel and his mom was home alone, and the reason he was here at all was because his family was falling apart. On Tuesday, Ian had his regular session with Oswald after school. I waited in the library like usual, trying to focus on my English homework, but mostly just watching the clock. When Ian came out of the counseling office, he walked over to where I was sitting and dropped into the chair across from me. He looked tired, but also kind of lighter somehow. He told me that Oswald had brought up the idea of family counseling, like actual sessions where his mom and dad would come in together and talk with a professional about how to deal with Madison's death as a family unit. Ian said Oswald thought it might help them communicate better, instead of everyone just suffering separately. His mom had apparently called Oswald that morning, and they'd already discussed it, and Raina was completely on board and ready to start whenever. But his dad was a different story. Ian pulled out his phone and showed me a text from Grayson that basically said therapy was for people who couldn't handle their own problems, and real men dealt with things internally. The text was short and harsh and made my chest feel tight just reading it. Ian put his phone away and stared at the table for a minute before saying that the divide between his parents were getting worse instead of better. His mom wanted to heal, and his dad wanted to pretend everything was fine, and Ian was stuck in the middle watching his family break apart in 2 different directions. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound stupid, so I just reached over and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, and we sat there in the quiet library with students walking past us, and the copy machine humming in the corner. The panic attack happened on Thursday during biology class. We were learning about genetics and inherited traits, and the teacher was explaining how certain conditions could be passed down through families. I was sitting 2 rows behind Ian taking notes when I noticed his shoulders getting really tense. Then he stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loud against the floor, and basically ran out of the classroom without asking permission. The teacher called after him, but he was already gone. I grabbed the bathroom pass without waiting to be dismissed and went looking for him. I checked the boys' bathroom near our classroom first and heard someone breathing really hard and fast inside. I knocked and called Ian's name and pushed the door open. He was sitting on the floor in the corner with his back against the wall, his hands shaking and his face pale and sweaty. His breathing came in these short gasps like he couldn't get enough air. I sat down next to him on the gross bathroom floor and told him to look at me. His eyes were wide and scared, and he kept saying he was going to end up like Madison, that depression was genetic and he'd inherited it and he was going to die the same way she did. He said it over and over between gasps for air, and I grabbed his hands and held them tight. I made him breathe with me, counting slowly in and out until his breathing started to match mine. It took maybe 10 minutes before he could breathe normally again, and his hands were freezing cold in mine. When he finally calmed down enough to talk without gasping, I helped him stand up and told him we were going to see Oswald right now. He started to argue, but I cut him off and said I wasn't asking. We walked through the empty hallways to the counseling office, and I didn't even knock, just opened the door and brought Ian inside. Oswald was meeting with another student, but he took one look at Ian's face and asked the other kid to come back during lunch. The student left, and Oswald cleared his desk and pulled 2 chairs close together. He sat down across from Ian and asked what happened in this calm voice that somehow made everything feel less scary. Ian explained about the biology class and the genetics discussion, and how he couldn't breathe because he was so scared he'd inherited depression and would end up killing himself too. Oswald listened without interrupting, and when Ian finished talking, the counselor leaned forward and explained that depression wasn't guaranteed just because Madison had it. He said mental health was complicated and involved lots of factors beyond just genetics, and being afraid of inheriting it was actually a really normal response to trauma. He talked about how fear made sense but didn't have to control Ian's whole life, and how recognizing the fear was actually the first step to managing it. Ian listened and cried quietly, and Oswald handed him tissues and kept talking in that steady voice. By the time the session ended, Ian looked exhausted but less panicked. Oswald walked us to the door and then asked me to wait outside for a minute. He closed the door, and I stood in the hallway wondering what they were talking about. When Ian came out 15 minutes later, he said Oswald wanted to call his mom about something. That afternoon, Oswald did call Raina. Ian told me about it later when we were walking home together. Oswald had strongly recommended that Ian see an actual psychiatrist to get assessed for anxiety and depression, and possibly get prescribed medication if the doctor thought it would help. Raina had agreed immediately and said she'd start making calls to find someone who specialized in adolescent mental health. But she'd also said that Grayson would absolutely fight the idea because he thought medication was a weakness, and Ian just needed to toughen up. Ian's face went pale when he told me this part. He said the idea of taking medication scared him because Madison had been on antidepressants and they hadn't saved her, so what was the point? He said he didn't want to become some drugged-up zombie who couldn't feel anything, and he was terrified of ending up dependent on pills. I didn't know how to respond to that because I didn't know anything about psychiatric medication, or whether it actually helped. We walked the rest of the way to my house in silence, and when we got inside, Ian went straight to the guest room and closed the door. The next day at lunch, Viola sat down at our table with her tray, and this serious look on her face. She glanced around at our group, which was me, Ian, Rika, and Maddie, and then she started talking. She said she needed to tell Ian something about Madison that she'd been keeping to herself because she didn't know if it would help or hurt. Ian put down his sandwich and stared at her, waiting. Viola took a deep breath and explained that Madison had been on antidepressants for about 6 months before she died, but she'd stopped taking them 2 months before the suicide. Madison had told Viola that the medication made her feel numb and weird, like she was watching her life happen instead of living it, and she hated that feeling, so she just quit. Viola said Madison hadn't told her parents or her doctor. She'd just stopped taking the pills and pretended everything was fine. Ian's face went completely white and his hands started shaking. He asked why Viola never told him this before, and Viola said she didn't know if it mattered, if it would have changed anything. Ian stood up from the table and his chair fell backward with a loud crash. He said if he'd known Madison stopped her medication, he could have noticed something was wrong. He could have told their parents. He could have done something. His voice got louder and people at other tables started looking over. Rika reached up and tried to get Ian to sit back down, but he pulled away. He said he could have saved her if he'd just been paying attention, and now it was too late, and he'd never get another chance. Then he grabbed his backpack and left the cafeteria, and Viola started crying into her hands. That night I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about everything that was happening with Ian and his family, and how it was all getting worse instead of better. I went downstairs around midnight and found my mom in the kitchen making tea. She asked if I wanted to talk, and I ended up telling her everything. I explained about Madison's suicide and Ian's grief and the panic attack and the medication discussion and how his parents were falling apart and how I was trying to help, but nothing seemed to be enough. My mom listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she sat down next to me at the kitchen table. She told me that I was 17 years old, and I couldn't fix Ian's family or heal his grief no matter how much I cared about him. She said supporting someone didn't mean sacrificing my own mental health, and I needed to recognize when something was too big for me to handle alone. She asked if I was taking care of myself while I was taking care of Ian, and I realized I wasn't. I'd been so focused on him that I hadn't thought about my own limits or needs. My mom hugged me and said it was okay to step back sometimes, that loving someone didn't mean drowning with them. The wake-up call came on Monday when my English teacher pulled me aside after class. She asked if everything was okay because my grades had dropped significantly over the past few weeks. I'd missed turning in 2 assignments and my last essay had been rushed and incomplete. She showed me my grade report and I stared at the numbers feeling sick. I'd gone from straight A's to mostly C's in less than a month. The teacher asked if something was happening at home or with friends that was affecting my schoolwork, and something inside me just broke. I started crying right there in the empty classroom and told her I didn't know how to be there for someone without losing myself completely. She handed me tissues and let me cry for a while. And then she suggested I talk to Oswald about balancing support with self-care. She said she'd give me extensions on the missing work, but I needed to figure out how to manage whatever was going on before my grades got even worse. That afternoon, Rika and Maddie cornered me at my locker and said we needed to talk. They took me to the coffee shop near school and made me sit down in one of the back booths. Rika started by saying they loved me, and they were worried about me. And Maddie jumped in saying this was an intervention, but a gentle one. They told me I was allowed to have boundaries even with people I cared about, and that I'd completely stop doing things I loved, because all my energy went to Ian. Rika pointed out that I hadn't taken a single photo in 3 weeks, and I used to carry my camera everywhere, and photography was my whole thing. Maddie said I'd canceled plans with them 4 times in the past 2 weeks, and I looked exhausted all the time, and they were scared I was going to burn out completely. They weren't telling me to abandon Ian, they said, but I needed to remember I was a person too with my own life and needs and limits. I sat there listening to them and realized they were right. I'd been so focused on saving Ian that I'd forgotten about everything else, including myself. That night, I texted Ian asking if we could talk, and he agreed to meet me at the park near school the next morning before classes started. I got there early and sat on one of the benches watching other students walk by with their backpacks and coffee cups. Ian showed up 10 minutes later looking tired and sat down next to me without saying anything. I took a deep breath and told him I needed to talk about us and how things had been going. He tensed up immediately like he thought I was about to end our friendship. I explained that I cared about him, but I'd been letting everything else in my life fall apart because I was so focused on being there for him. I told him about my grades dropping and missing assignments and how my teacher had pulled me aside. Ian's face went pale and he started apologizing before I even finished talking. He said he was sorry for taking up so much of my life, and he hadn't realized how much I was sacrificing. He admitted he'd been leaning on me way too hard because I was the only person who didn't treat him like he was broken or about to break. His voice cracked when he said he didn't want to be the reason I was struggling. I reached over and squeezed his hand and told him I wasn't blaming him, but we needed to figure out a better balance. We spent the next hour talking through what that could look like. We decided that study time would be completely separate, so I could focus on catching up my grades. We agreed that we'd each maintain our own friendships instead of me abandoning Rika and Maddie all the time. And most importantly, Ian promised to start building other support people in his life so I wasn't his only person. It felt scary pulling back even slightly because I worried he'd think I didn't care anymore, but it also felt healthier and more realistic for both of us. Ian hugged me before we left for class and thanked me for being honest with him, instead of just disappearing like other people had done. 2 days later, Ian had his appointment with the psychiatrist that Oswald had recommended. I waited outside the office building for him, and when he came out an hour later, he looked drained but also kind of relieved. We walked to a nearby coffee shop and he told me what happened. The doctor diagnosed him with depression and anxiety related to trauma and grief from losing Madison. Ian said hearing it out loud made it feel more real somehow, like his feelings weren't just him being weak or broken. The psychiatrist recommended therapy combined with medication, and Ian agreed to try it even though he was nervous. He kept saying he didn't want to end up like Madison, who had been on medication before she stopped taking it. I reminded him that medication affects everyone differently, and that he'd be monitored closely. He nodded, but I could tell he was still scared about the whole thing. Starting the medication was rough. The first week, Ian dealt with constant nausea and headaches that made it hard for him to focus in class. He texted me almost every hour saying he felt worse than before, and maybe this was a mistake. I tried to be supportive, but I also remembered our boundaries conversation, so I encouraged him to talk to Oswald about it too. Oswald met with Ian during lunch one day and assured him that side effects usually improve after the first couple weeks, and the actual benefits take longer to show up. Ian stuck with it even though I could tell he wanted to quit. He'd text me updates about how he was feeling and I'd respond, but I made sure not to let it consume my whole day like before. It was hard finding that balance between being there for him and taking care of myself. Meanwhile, something big happened with Ian's family. Raina finally reached her breaking point with Grayson's refusal to deal with anything. Ian told me his mom threatened to separate from his dad if he didn't agree to at least one family counseling session. Grayson apparently yelled that therapy was useless and wouldn't bring Madison back. But Raina stood her ground and said she couldn't keep living with someone who refused to heal or even try. The next day, Grayson agreed to one session, just one. Ian was shocked his dad gave in at all because Grayson had been so stubborn about the whole thing. The family counseling session happened on a Thursday afternoon, and Ian said it was one of the hardest things he'd ever sat through. The counselor was patient but direct, and didn't let any of them avoid the difficult topics. Grayson spent the first 20 minutes with his arms crossed, saying this was pointless. But then the counselor asked him to talk about Madison, and what he missed most about her. Grayson's face crumpled, and he started talking about how she used to wait by the door for him to get home from work. He described how she'd show him her drawings and ask him to hang them on the fridge. His voice broke when he said he failed to protect her and didn't know how to be a father anymore when he couldn't save his own daughter. Ian told me it was the first time he'd ever heard his dad cry actual sobbing that shook his whole body. The counselor helped them understand that Grayson's anger was also grief, just expressed differently, and that Madison's death wasn't anyone's fault no matter how much they wanted someone to blame. Something shifted between Ian and his dad during that session. Not fixed, but different. Like maybe they could eventually talk to each other again. 3 weeks into taking medication and going to regular therapy sessions, Ian started showing small improvements. He told me he was sleeping better at night instead of lying awake replaying memories of Madison. He didn't snap at people as quickly when they said something that bothered him, and he could talk about Madison without immediately falling apart into tears. The changes were subtle and some days were still really hard, but they were real changes that gave him hope things could actually get better. I noticed the difference too in how he carried himself, and how he didn't seem as weighed down all the time. One afternoon, Ian came up to me between classes and said he wanted to do something to honor Madison's memory. He'd been thinking about it a lot and wanted to create something positive from all the pain. I asked what he had in mind, and he said he wasn't sure yet. Later that day, Viola joined us at lunch, and when Ian mentioned his idea, her whole face lit up. She suggested starting a mental health awareness club at the school. She said the school needed better resources and education about depression and suicide prevention. Ian loved the idea immediately. They decided to approach the administration together and asked me to come with them for support. The principal listened to their proposal and approved it right away. She said the school had been wanting to do something like this since Madison's death, but didn't know how to start it. She offered to help them get funding and find a faculty advisor. The mental health club's first meeting happened 3 weeks later in the library after school. Ian and Viola had put up flyers around school, but they weren't sure anyone would actually show up. 20 students came through the door. Some I recognized and others I'd never seen before. Ian stood at the front of the room looking nervous while Viola welcomed everyone and explained what the club would be about. Then Ian did something incredible. He spoke about Madison publicly for the first time since she died. He told the whole room about losing his sister to suicide and how he'd been struggling with grief and guilt. His voice shook, but he kept going. He talked about starting therapy and medication and how hard it was to ask for help. When he finished, several students started sharing their own experiences with depression and anxiety and loss. One girl talked about her brother's suicide attempt. A guy shared about his panic attacks. Another student described losing their best friend. Ian's honesty had created space for everyone else to be real too. I sat in the back watching and felt so proud of how far he'd come from the guy who used to run away from me on the track. The second club meeting happened 2 weeks later, and this time Raina and Grayson showed up as parent volunteers. Ian had asked them to come and they both agreed, which shocked him. Watching them work together to set up chairs and hand out information sheets felt like the first step toward healing their marriage. During the meeting, Grayson actually stood up and shared briefly about struggling with his daughter's death. He said he'd been angry for so long because he didn't know what else to do with the pain. Several parents in the room nodded like they understood exactly what he meant. Raina reached over and held his hand while he talked. Ian caught my eye from across the room and smiled a real, genuine smile that made everything we'd been through feel worth it. The anniversary of Madison's death came on a cold Thursday in March. Our whole friend group met Ian and his parents at the cemetery entrance that morning before school. Rika brought white roses because those were Madison's favorite. Maddie carried a small potted plant we could leave at the grave. Viola showed up with a photo album she'd made of her and Madison together. Ian stood between his mom and dad looking nervous but determined. Raina held Grayson's hand tight while we all walked together to Madison's grave. The headstone was simple with her name and dates and a quote about being loved. Ian knelt down first and placed his hand on the cold stone. Viola sat next to him and opened the photo album. She started sharing memories about Madison making everyone laugh during lunch with her terrible jokes. Rika told a story about how Madison once wore 2 different shoes to the school on purpose, just to see if anyone would notice. Maddie remembered Madison helping her study for biology, even though Madison was a year younger. I shared how Madison always smiled at everyone in the hallways even when she was having a bad day. Grayson's voice cracked when he talked about Madison's love for painting and how their garage still had her art supplies. Raina cried while describing how Madison used to make pancakes every Sunday morning. Then Ian pulled out a folded letter from his jacket pocket. His hands shook as he unfolded it and started reading out loud. He thanked Madison for being his sister and his friend. He told her he was sorry for not seeing how much she was hurting. He promised to live fully enough for both of them and to help other people who felt like she did. His voice broke several times, but he kept reading until the end. When he finished, we all stood there quietly for a while. The wind blew through the trees, and it felt like Madison was there with us somehow. After we left the cemetery, Ian asked if I wanted to walk around the neighborhood instead of going straight to the school. We walked in silence for a few blocks before he finally spoke. He said he needed to tell me something he'd been thinking about since the bookstore. He admitted he had feelings for me but wasn't ready for a relationship while he was still working through everything with therapy and medication. I told him I understood completely, and that friendship felt right for now anyway. We both agreed that what we had was too important to rush or mess up by forcing something we weren't ready for. He smiled and said he was glad I got it. I bumped his shoulder with mine and told him he was stuck with me either way. We made it to the school just as the late bell rang. 3 weeks later, the mental health club organized a school-wide assembly during 4th period. Viola and Ian had spent weeks planning it with help from the principal. They invited 3 speakers who'd lost loved ones to suicide to share their stories. The gym was packed with students and teachers filling every bleacher. The first speaker was a mom who lost her teenage son 5 years ago. She talked about the warning signs she missed and how she wished she'd asked more questions. The second speaker was a college student whose best friend died by suicide during freshman year. He described the guilt and anger he felt, and how therapy helped him process it. The third speaker was a teacher from another school, whose brother struggled with depression for years before taking his own life. She emphasized that mental health is just as important as physical health. When the assembly ended, the applause was loud and long. I watched students wiping tears and hugging each other. Several kids lined up afterward to talk to the school counselor about getting help. I saw at least 10 students approach him asking for referrals or information about therapy. Ian stood near the gym doors watching everyone, and I could tell he felt proud. Viola came over and hugged him tight. She whispered something that made him smile. That same week, Ian showed up to football practice after school. He hadn't been on the field since before Madison died. His coach saw him coming and jogged over immediately. The coach put his hand on Ian's shoulder and told him they'd missed him. He said Ian could take things at his own pace and there was no pressure to play in games right away. Ian's teammates gathered around and several guys patted his back or shook his hand. Nobody made it weird or asked uncomfortable questions. They just welcomed him back like he'd never left. Ian started with conditioning drills and light practice. I watched from the bleachers while doing homework. He looked different out there. Not like he was trying to be the old Ian everyone remembered. Just like someone who genuinely missed playing football and wanted to be part of a team again. After practice, he came over sweaty and grinning. He said it felt good to do something normal again. A few days later, Viola approached Ian and me at lunch with an idea. She wanted to create a memorial scholarship in Madison's name for students pursuing mental health careers. Ian loved it immediately. They spent the next month planning fundraisers and reaching out to local businesses for donations. They organized a bake sale that raised $300. They set up a donation table at the spring concert. Viola's parents contributed a large amount and convinced their friends to donate too. Ian's parents added money and helped spread the word through their work connections. I watched Viola and Ian work together and saw how close they were becoming. They bonded over their shared love for Madison and their commitment to preventing other families from experiencing the same loss. Sometimes they'd sit together looking at old photos of Madison and crying, but also laughing at funny memories. By the end of the month, they'd raised enough money to fund a small scholarship for one student each year. 6 months after the bookstore revelation, everything felt different. Ian's family was doing better. Not perfect, but functional in ways they hadn't been since Madison died. Grayson attended therapy sessions every week now and actually talked about his feelings. Raina stopped trying to hold everything together alone and let herself fall apart when she needed to. They were learning to talk about Madison without everyone falling apart completely. Ian told me his parents were even considering couples counseling to work on their marriage. He said dinner at home didn't feel like walking on eggshells anymore. They could laugh again without feeling guilty. They could mention Madison's name without the room going silent and tense. During one of our study sessions at the library, Ian told me his medication was working really well. He said the first few months were rough with side effects and finding the right dose. But now he felt more stable than he had in over a year. He'd learned coping strategies in therapy that actually helped when he felt overwhelmed. Things like breathing exercises and identifying negative thought patterns before they spiraled. He said he wasn't cured and probably never would be. But he was managing his mental health actively instead of just surviving each day. He could feel when he was having a bad day and knew how to ask for help instead of shutting everyone out. By the end of the school year, the mental health club became a permanent fixture. The principal announced it would continue with official school funding and support. She assigned the school counselor as the faculty advisor. Ian and Viola agreed to co-president the club during their senior year. They created a whole system of resources and support that would outlast their graduation. They set up peer counseling training for students who wanted to help their friends. They organized monthly awareness events and guest speakers. They made informational posters about warning signs and how to get help. Watching them build something lasting from their grief felt important and right. On what would have been Madison's 17th birthday, Ian's family went to her favorite park. They invited Viola and our friend group to join them. Everyone brought balloons with messages written on them for Madison. Ian wrote about the scholarship and the mental health club. Viola wrote about missing her best friend every single day. Raina and Grayson wrote about loving her forever. I wrote about how Madison's life mattered and changed things even after she was gone. We all released the balloons at the same time and watched them float up into the sky. It was sad but also beautiful in a way that felt right. Ian smiled while watching the balloons disappear. He said Madison would have made fun of the cheesy gesture and called us all dramatic. Everyone laughed because he was absolutely right. We stayed at the park for hours just talking and remembering Madison together. When prom night arrived, Ian asked if I wanted to go with him as friends. I said yes immediately because it sounded fun and low pressure. We got dressed up and met at my house for photos. My mom cried and took about 100 pictures. Ian looked good in his suit and I wore a simple blue dress. At prom, we hung out with our whole friend group and danced badly to every song. Rika and Maddie made fun of Ian's terrible dance moves. Viola taught us some line dance she learned at a wedding. We ate too much food and laughed until our faces hurt. For whole stretches of time, the grief didn't define everything. We were just normal high school kids having fun at prom. Ian and I slow danced during one song and he thanked me for everything. I told him he didn't need to thank me. He said he did because I saved his life by being annoying and persistent. I laughed and said he saved mine too by letting me in. We stayed until the very end when they turned on the lights and kicked everyone out. Walking to the parking lot, Ian grabbed my hand and squeezed it. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. We both knew we'd been through hell together and come out okay on the other side. A few weeks before graduation, Ian got his college acceptance letter in the mail. He texted me a photo of it with just 3 words attached. I opened the message and saw the acceptance from State University with his note saying, "Psychology major confirmed." I called him immediately and he picked up on the second ring, sounding more excited than I'd heard in months. He explained that he'd been thinking about it since starting therapy with Oswald and realized he wanted to help other people going through what he went through. He said Madison's death taught him that mental health wasn't just important, it was everything, and he needed to do something about it. The way his voice sounded so sure and steady made me realize how far he'd actually come from that angry, withdrawn guy I'd chased around school. Viola texted our group chat the next day, announcing she'd also gotten into state, and suggested meeting up to talk about plans. We grabbed coffee after school, and she brought a whole notebook full of ideas for starting a mental health awareness chapter at their college. Ian and Viola sat across from each other, mapping out how they'd recruit members and what kind of programs they wanted to run. I felt this weird mix of proud and sad watching them plan their future together while I'd be hours away at a different school. When they finally looked up from their planning, Viola reached across the table and grabbed my hand. She reminded me that distance didn't erase what we'd been through together, and that our friendship was built on something way stronger than just going to the same school. Ian nodded and said we'd make it work because we had to, and I believed him. Graduation day arrived hot and sunny with everyone crammed into the football stadium. I sat with my family scanning the crowd until I spotted Ian's parents sitting together about 10 rows up. Grayson had his arm around Raina's shoulders, and they were holding hands resting on the armrest between them. When they called Ian's name and he walked across that stage, both his parents stood up and cheered louder than anyone else in the whole stadium. I watched Raina's hand move to her chest, touching the small silver locket she wore, and I knew it had Madison's photo inside. Ian grabbed his diploma and turned to face the crowd with this huge, genuine smile that reminded me of the old Ian everyone used to know. The summer after graduation felt strange and final, like we were all trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. One afternoon in July, our whole friend group met at the cemetery where Madison was buried. Ian carried a bunch of fresh sunflowers because Viola said those were Madison's favorite. He knelt down in front of the headstone and carefully arranged the flowers in the built-in vase. Then he started talking to Madison like she was right there with us, telling her about getting into college and majoring in psychology. He told her about the mental health club at the school and how many students it helped this year. He said he was okay now. Not perfect, and probably never would be completely fine, but genuinely okay in a way that felt real and lasting. We all stood there together, not saying anything, just letting the moment exist without trying to fill it with words. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward, like we were all honoring Madison's memory, while also celebrating that Ian found his way back to actually living. Standing there in that cemetery with the sun beating down and my friends surrounding me, I realized this was the best thing we could give Madison, showing her that her brother survived and turned his pain into something that helped other people.